Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on what is arguably the most consequential decade of the 20th century, 1945 to 1955. This is the genesis of the Cold War, that critical period when the United States and the Soviet Union went from being uneasy wartime allies into what became existential global adversaries.
And the central conflict, of course, was rooted in these just irreconcilable ideological differences. You had the USA advocating for capitalism and, political pluralism versus the USSR's deep commitment to communism and state-controlled one-party rule. This mistrust was there long before the war even ended.
Exactly. So the crucial question for historians, and the one we're going to wrestle with today, is one of historical responsibility. Who was primarily to blame for the Cold War? I'm going to argue that the USSR bore the main responsibility, primarily due to definitive, aggressive, expansionist actions and the willful breaking of international agreements.
And I come at it from a different way. Well, recognizing that ideological chasm, I believe that assigning primary blame to Moscow really overlooks the massive and, frankly, unilateral shift in global power dynamics that was initiated by the United States. I see the conflict not as a result of a single aggressor's drive, but as a catastrophic cycle of escalation and profound mistrust, often fueled by U.S. actions. So I would argue that responsibility is far more equally distributed.
Well, I think we need to interrogate the timeline and the nature of the breaches here. Because while ideology was the underlying tension, the critical turning point was the Soviet Union's calculated political actions on the ground after the war. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allies agreed to the Declaration on Liberated Europe. They promised free and unfettered elections to allow the people of Eastern Europe to choose their own governments. This was meant to be the foundation of the post-war order.
Right? A key agreement.
A key agreement, yet Stalin systematically broke these promises almost immediately. He didn't just influence these regions, he installed compliant communist minority governments, often bypassing democratic processes entirely. The West correctly perceived this as a profound betrayal of wartime trust and commitment. This deliberate establishment of control wasn't achieved through popular mandate. It used a cynical and gradual method we now know as salami tactics between 1945 and 49. This involved systematically eliminating non-communist opposition piece by piece. First, they'd control the internal security ministries, especially the police. Then they would ban or merge opposition parties, crush dissent, and rig elections, all under the pretense of coalition governments. This is how they absorbed crucial states like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. This wasn't securing a defensive zone, this was aggressive, ideological, political takeover, and it confirmed every Western fear that the USSR's ultimate goal was global expansion.
That is a very powerful indictment of Soviet policy in Eastern Europe, I agree. But I have to challenge the premise that Stalin's actions were the sole catalyst. I mean, attributing the conflict's start primarily to Soviet political maneuvering just minimizes the sheer magnitude of the U.S. unilateral power shift that happened in August 1945. The use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an action taken without any meaningful warning to their Soviet ally, was arguably the single most important aggressive act that launched the Cold War.
I see where you're going, but
Well, this wasn't just a military decision to end the war in the Pacific. It was a clear demonstration of overwhelming, unchecked power. Many historians, like Garl Perovitz, have argued it was intended to intimidate the Soviet Union, to force concessions in post-war negotiations. Stalin certainly saw it that way, believing the bomb was designed to pressure Moscow. This immediately helped start the arms race, and it dramatically shifted the dynamics at the Potsdam Conference that summer. Truman, now armed with this weapon, was far more suspicious, far more aggressive in his tone than Roosevelt had been. He was signaling to the Soviets that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed.
Okay, I agree that the A-bomb was a massive shock. It absolutely accelerated the arms race, but let's be precise about the nature of aggression here. A military deterrent, however terrifying, is distinct from the deliberate, ongoing political subjugation of sovereign nations. You claim the A-bomb fueled Soviet fear, but the Soviet Union had already laid the groundwork for control in Eastern Europe before the bomb was even dropped, based on where the Red Army stood. The subsequent Soviet actions, violating Yalta, imposing salami tactics, they weren't defensive. They were the concrete, irreversible steps that turned theoretical mistrust into a structural global conflict.
Western fears, as outlined in the famous Kennan telegram of February 1946, which defined the USSR as inherently expansionist, were validated by facts on the ground, not just speculation about American bombs.
I think we risk creating a false equivalence, though. The Soviet control of Eastern Europe was brutal, yes, but we have to see it in the context of their desperate historical security needs. You're talking about a country that lost 20 million people in the war and suffered 2 brutal German invasions routed through that very territory.
Of course, the losses were staggering.
Right. So this context provided Stalin with a strong, if cynical, rationale for consolidating a defensive buffer. And furthermore, if you're going to cite the Kennan telegram, which cemented U.S. containment policy, we must equally acknowledge the Novikov telegram sent by the Soviet ambassador Nikolai Novikov in September 1946. This mirroring document painted the USA as imperialist, aiming for world domination using its military and economic pressure. For Moscow, consolidating that buffer was a reactive measure to perceived U.S. global aggression, and Kennan's report was a deliberate hardening of U.S. policy, a shift away from negotiation toward a rigid framework that saw the Soviet Union as a permanent existential threat.
Okay, so let's discuss those subsequent policies then, because I would argue they were primarily responses to Soviet actions. If containment was the strategy, the Truman Doctrine in March 1947 was the first major tactical execution. It promised U.S. financial and military support to any country threatened by communism, specifically targeting Greece and Turkey. I argue this was an essential move to prevent Soviet expansion into strategic areas of the Mediterranean, areas vital to the West. This declaration was necessary precisely because the Soviet agenda was so demonstrably aggressive.
Art, I challenge the interpretation that the Truman Doctrine was purely defensive. From Moscow's perspective, this was a declaration of global interference. It was an assertion of U.S. hegemony, an explicit blueprint for encircling the Soviet Union. It was a massive philosophical shift for the U.S., moving it from isolationism into the role of the world's policeman right in the USSR's perceived sphere of influence. And this leads directly to the economic side of things. The Marshall Plan, launched in June 1947, was ostensibly aid to rebuild Europe, but it was, fundamentally, a political and ideological weapon.
A weapon how? It was offering to rebuild their economies.
Because the aid was conditioned on capitalist trade principles, free markets, financial transparency, all elements designed to bind nations into the American economic sphere. Stalin viewed this, correctly, as economic imperialism. He rejected the aid for the USSR and banned the Eastern European states from accepting it, claiming it was a Trojan horse designed to subvert communist influence. The U.S. was actively partitioning the continent, forcing nations to choose between 2 opposed economic blocs.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the USSR's rejection and its subsequent formation of Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau, in 1947, were the definitive actions that formalized the division. Cominform was far more than an information exchange. It was the institutional tool used to enforce ideological purity, to ensure absolute loyalty to Moscow. By forcing its satellites to refuse Marshall aid, the USSR effectively isolated them from Western recovery, harming their own economies and cementing the very two-block system that Moscow itself created. And, what's more, the formation of NATO in April 1949 was not some unprovoked act. It was created after the USSR's aggression during the Berlin blockade. Stalin's attempt to starve West Berlin into submission by cutting off all land routes was the first major, violent crisis of the Cold War. It proved the Soviets were willing to use coercive force against civilians to achieve their goals. NATO was the collective answer, a promise of military defense against proven Soviet expansionism.
I understand why you see NATO as a defensive necessity born from the Berlin blockade. But we have to acknowledge that the blockade itself was a direct response to Western policy in Germany. Specifically, the introduction of a new currency in the western sectors of Berlin without consultation. It was a severe miscalculation by Stalin, yes, but it was rooted in a reaction to Western unilateral action. And more importantly, the formation of NATO marked a profound historic shift. It was America's first peacetime military alliance outside the Western Hemisphere. To Moscow, this was the ultimate strategic threat, a permanent armed alliance dedicated to containment. Regardless of whether you label it defensive, it placed U.S. military power directly on the Soviet periphery. The USA dropped the A-bomb first, it established containment first, and it formed the major military alliance first. These are sequential acts of aggressive posturing.
While the sequence is important, the core principle of NATO was collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. It was a response mechanism, not an offensive one. The USSR responded 6 years later with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, explicitly triggered by West Germany joining NATO. So this just demonstrates a cycle where Soviet aggressive political actions, violating Yalta, the blockade, led to Western defensive alignment, which the USSR then used as justification to harden the divisions even further. The initial aggressive breach of the post-war order has to lie with the actor who first violated those political agreements to impose their ideology.
That's a compelling point at the political breaches. But I maintain that you are weighing political imposition heavier than nuclear and military intimidation. Have we really considered the sheer weight of mutual fear and the pervasive misunderstanding that defined this decade? Both sides genuinely believed the other wanted world domination. Stalin because of Marxist-Leninist ideology, and U.S. leaders because of the domino theory. This framework meant that the defensive actions of one side, whether it was the U.S. forming NATO or the USSR securing a buffer, were perpetually seen as existential, aggressive threats by the other. This dynamic of tit-for-tat escalation, where responsibility is constantly shifted back and forth, means the conflict wasn't caused by a single aggressor. It was an inevitable clash driven by the interaction of two systems. Therefore, the blame has to be shared.
Ultimately, while acknowledging the profound shock of the A-bomb and the hardening effect of the Kennan telegram, my position remains that the critical, irreversible steps that transformed mistrust into open conflict were Soviet actions. The imposition of communist rule on nations promised self-determination, the use of salami tactics, the initiation of the Berlin blockade, these were the moves that created undeniable facts on the ground. These actions, rooted in Soviet ideology, forced the USA and its allies into a policy of containment, thereby guaranteeing the structure of the Cold War.
And I would summarize by re-emphasizing the role of U.S. unilateral power, the A-bomb establishing a new level of threat, and the institutionalization of U.S. hostility through the Truman Doctrine, which the Soviets rightly viewed as imperialistic encirclement. The conflict was driven by this interaction of overwhelming mutual suspicion and defensive actions being consistently misread as outright aggression. The evidence from 1945 to 1955 suggests the conflict was an inevitable escalation between two opposed systems, both trying to secure their own positions in a fractured world.
What this period demonstrates, I think, is the crucial value of examining this evidence from multiple perspectives. Was the overriding cause the Soviet will to aggressively expand its ideology into territories promised freedom, or was it the U.S. will to globally contain that ideology through aggressive economic and military posturing?
Indeed. Both the USA and the USSR took significant, escalating actions, ideological expansion, countered by massive military and economic assertions of power, that led to the definitive division of the world. Understanding who was to blame requires weighing the severity of broken political promises against the weight of a sudden and massive shift in global military power. The historical record provides powerful evidence for both perspectives.